The dust, kicked up by 1,000 hooves, still hung in the amber evening air as Samuel Big Sam Morrison surveyed his empire from the wraparound porch of his sprawling ranch house. Cedar Valley stretched before him like a brown and gold carpet, dotted with his prized cattle that grazed as far as the eye could see. The September sun cast long shadows across the land he'd spent 20 years building into the most prosperous spread in 3 counties. At 42, Sam commanded respect wherever he rode. His broad shoulders filled his tailored vest, and his silver mustache was always perfectly groomed despite the harsh frontier life. When he walked into Millfield's only saloon, conversations quieted. When he conducted business at the general store, shopkeepers scrambled to serve him first. He owned half the buildings on Main Street, employed 30 ranch hands, and his cattle drives supplied beef to railroad towns as far east as Kansas City. "Mr. Morrison, sir," called out young Tommy Fletcher, his newest ranch hand, as he hurried up to the porch. The boy's hat was askew, and his shirt was damp with sweat from the day's work. "The boys finished moving that last herd to the north pasture, just like you wanted." Sam nodded curtly, not bothering to look at the young man. "About time. Make sure they get those fences checked before sundown. Can't afford to lose any head to wanderers." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. As Tommy scurried away, Sam's attention was drawn to a commotion on the main road leading into town. A colorful procession was making its way through the valley. Wagons painted in bright reds and yellows, topped with canvas covers and pulled by tired horses. Even from a distance, he could make out the faded lettering on the lead wagon: Professor Beaumont's Traveling Circus and Wonder Show. Sam's lip curled in disdain. Circus folk, drifters and misfits who couldn't make an honest living like decent people. They'd roll into town with their flashy tricks and loud music, separate hard-working folks from their money, then disappear in the night, leaving nothing but trampled grass and empty pockets behind. He strode into his house, letting the screen door slam behind him. The interior was a testament to his success. Polished hardwood floors, imported furniture from back east, and oil paintings of prize bulls adorning the walls. His late wife Margaret's china still sat in the dining room cabinet, though it hadn't been used since her passing 5 years ago. The house felt too big for one man, but Sam told himself he kept it this way to remind visitors of his standing in the community. The next morning, Sam rode into Millfield on his prize stallion, a magnificent black gelding named Thunder. The town was already buzzing with excitement about the circus, which had set up camp in the field behind McKinnon's livery stable. Colorful banners fluttered in the morning breeze, and the smell of hay and exotic spices drifted through the air. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," called out Pete Hartwell, the bank president, tipping his hat as Sam dismounted outside the Dusty Rose saloon. "Quite a spectacle they've brought to town, isn't it?" Sam tied Thunder's reins to the hitching post with more force than necessary. "Spectacle's the right word for it, Pete. Nothing but a bunch of charlatans looking to fleece honest folks of their hard-earned money." Pete chuckled nervously. "Well, I reckon the children are excited. My own little ones have been pestering their mother all morning about going to see the show tonight. Your children would be better served learning the value of honest work instead of watching grown men make fools of themselves for coin," Sam replied, pushing through the saloon doors. The Dusty Rose was already busy despite the early hour. Ranch hands, shopkeepers, and traveling merchants filled the tables, and the conversation was dominated by talk of the circus. Sam took his usual seat at the bar, and Mary O'Sullivan, the saloon owner's daughter, immediately poured him his regular whiskey. "Afternoon show starts at 2, evening show at 7, announced Jake Wheeler, a local farmer, to his drinking companions. "They got acrobats, a strong man, trained horses, and even a fortune teller." "Fortune teller," Sam snorted, loud enough for half the saloon to hear. "What's next? A man who claims he can fly? These people prey on the simple-minded, selling them dreams and nonsense." The saloon grew quieter as men turned to listen. Sam Morrison's opinions carried weight, and many looked to him for guidance on matters both business and social. "Now, Sam," said Doc Williams, the town's physician, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "surely there's no harm in a bit of entertainment. These people travel hard roads to bring a little joy to frontier towns." Sam's eyes flashed. "Joy. There's joy in a good day's work, in building something lasting, in contributing to your community. These performers are nothing but grown children playing dress-up, too lazy or too worthless to make something of themselves in the real world." His words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Several men nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sam had spoken, and his word was law in Cedar Valley. Outside, the sounds of the circus preparing for their afternoon show drifted through the saloon windows. Hammers striking stakes, horses whinnying, and voices calling out in languages Sam didn't recognize. To him, these sounds represented everything that was wrong with people who couldn't settle down and build a proper life. He finished his whiskey in one gulp and stood up, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Mark my words, gentlemen. By tomorrow night, half of you will be poorer for having wasted your money on their nonsense, and they'll be long gone with your coin, heading to the next town full of fools." As he walked toward the door, Sam caught sight of movement through the window. A small figure in a faded brown dress was crossing the street, carrying a large pot and heading toward the general store. Even from behind, he could see the woman's dress was stained and patched, her hair escaping from a simple bun. Circus folk, no doubt. Just another example of the kind of people who chose to live outside the boundaries of respectable society. Sam pushed through the doors and mounted Thunder, determined to ride back to his ranch where things made sense, where hard work was rewarded, and there was no time for childish fantasies. But as he rode past the circus camp, he couldn't help but notice the dedication with which these people worked to prepare their show, the way they moved with purpose despite their shabby appearance. He shook his head, dismissing such thoughts. Purpose or not, they were still drifters, and Cedar Valley would be better off once they moved on. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the circus camp as Rosa Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her flour-dusted hand. At 28, she had been with Professor Beaumont's traveling show for 6 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident back in Colorado, leaving her with nothing but debt and the skills her grandmother had taught her in the kitchen. Rosa's domain was a converted wagon that served as the circus's mobile kitchen, cramped but efficiently organized. Pots hung from hooks along the walls, spices were stored in carefully labeled jars, and a small, wood-burning stove provided heat for cooking. Despite the modest accommodations, she took pride in feeding the 30-some members of their traveling family. Every meal was prepared with care, using whatever ingredients she could find or afford in each new town. "Rosa, the beans smell incredible," called out Marie Dubois, the circus's star acrobat, as she practiced her routine nearby. Marie was a small woman with calloused hands and muscles like steel cables, who could contort her body in ways that defied natural law. Despite the physical demands of her profession, she always had a kind word for Rosa. "Merci, Marie," Rosa replied in the French accent that still colored her English after years of traveling with people from all corners of the world. "I found some good chorizo at the mercado this morning. It will make all the difference." The circus was a melting pot of languages, cultures, and talents. There was Giuseppe, the Italian strongman who could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, but cried when he read letters from his mother. Hans, the German animal trainer who spoke to his horses in gentle whispers and treated them like beloved children. Professor Beaumont himself, a dignified man from Boston who had given up a comfortable life as a literature teacher to chase his dream of bringing wonder to small towns across America. These people had become Rosa's family. They looked out for each other, shared their meager earnings when times were tough, and celebrated each other's successes. It wasn't the life she had planned, But it was a good life, filled with people who valued her for her skills and her kindness, rather than judging her by her appearance or circumstances. As the afternoon show began, Rosa cleaned her kitchen and prepared ingredients for the evening meal. Through the thin canvas walls of her wagon, she could hear the crowd's reactions. Gasps of amazement at Marie's aerial feats, laughter at the clown's antics, and thunderous applause for Giuseppe's strength demonstrations. These sounds filled her with a warm satisfaction. Her food gave these performers the energy they needed to bring joy to families across the frontier. The show ended to enthusiastic applause, and Rosa was just beginning to prepare dinner when she heard a commotion outside. Peering through her wagon's small window, she saw a group of well-dressed men approaching the circus area. At their head rode a man on a magnificent black horse, his silver moustache glinting in the late afternoon sun. "Well, well," the man said in a voice that carried clearly across the camp, "so these are Professor Beaumont's famous performers." Professor Beaumont, still wearing his ringmaster's red coat, approached the group with dignity. Despite being in his 60s, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had faced down hostile crowds and financial hardship with equal composure. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed our show. We have another performance tonight that promises to be even more spectacular." The man on horseback, who Rosa now recognized as the wealthy rancher the townspeople spoke about with such deference, looked down at the professor with barely concealed disdain. "I'm Sam Morrison. I own the land from here to the mountains, and I'd like to know just what kind of people we're hosting in our community." His tone made Rosa's stomach tighten with a familiar anxiety. She had encountered men like Morrison before, men who looked at circus folk and saw only what they chose to see, not the hard work and dedication that went into their craft. "We are honest performers, Mr. Morrison," Professor Beaumont replied calmly. "We earn our living by bringing entertainment to families, and we leave each town cleaner than we found it." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Honest performers, that's rich." He gestured dismissively at the circus camp. "I see grown men in makeup pretending to be clowns, foreigners who probably can't even speak proper English, and women in, well, clothing that would make a proper lady blush." Rosa watched from her window as Marie stepped forward, her practice clothes still damp with sweat from rehearsal. "Monsieur Morrison, we work very hard to perfect our art. Each performance requires years of training and—" "Art?" Morrison interrupted, his voice growing louder. "Art is a painting in a museum or a poem by a learned man. What you people do is undignified. It's beneath the standards of civilized society." Rosa's hands clenched into fists as she watched her friends absorb this verbal assault. She had heard such words before, but they never lost their sting. The assumption that because they lived differently, because they didn't own land or wear fine clothes, they were somehow less worthy of respect. Giuseppe, the strong man, took a step forward, his impressive frame tensing. "Signore Morrison, we may not have your money, but we have dignity. We bring happiness to children and families. What is wrong with this?" Morrison's gaze swept over Giuseppe with contempt. "What's wrong is that you're teaching children to value spectacle over substance, flash over hard work. You're filling their heads with dreams of running away to join the circus instead of settling down and contributing to their communities like decent people." The crowd of townspeople that had gathered to watch began murmuring among themselves. Some nodded in agreement with Morrison's words, while others looked uncomfortable with his harsh tone. Rosa couldn't stand it any longer. She opened her wagon door and stepped outside, still wearing her stained apron and with flour in her hair. The conversation stopped as all eyes turned to her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the camp. "I could not help but hear your words, Signor Morrison." Morrison's gaze fixed on her, and she saw his expression shift from general disdain to something more personal and cruel. "And who might you be? The fortune-teller? The bearded lady?" The crowd chuckled, and Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she had faced worse than this man's mockery. "I am Rosa Martinez. I am the cook for our circus family." "The cook," Morrison repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. He dismounted from his horse and walked closer, his polished boots kicking up dust. "Well now, I suppose every group of vagabonds needs someone to heat up their beans and hardtack." More laughter from the crowd. Rosa saw her circus family watching her with concern, but she stood her ground. "I feed 30 people every day, Signor Morrison. I make sure they have the strength to perform, to bring joy to families like yours." Morrison circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Joy to families like mine. My family built this valley. We turned wilderness into productive ranch land. We employ honest workers and contribute to the growth of civilization." He paused in front of her, looking her up and down with obvious disgust. "What exactly do you contribute, besides whatever it is you call cooking?" The words hit Rosa like physical blows. She was acutely aware of her appearance. Her simple dress, with its inevitable stains from a day of cooking, her work-roughened hands, her hair escaping from its bun. Beside Morrison's polished perfection, she knew she looked exactly like what he saw, a poor woman with no status or security. I do my best to," she began, but Morrison cut her off. "Your best?" He laughed again, and this time several townspeople joined in. "Look at yourself, woman. You're covered in grease stains. Your hands look like you've been wrestling cattle, and I'd wager you don't even know how to prepare a meal fit for civilized people." The laughter grew louder. Rosa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of this man, not in front of these people who were so quick to judge what they didn't understand. Morrison wasn't finished. He had found his target and was savoring the moment. "I'll bet you've never even seen the inside of a proper kitchen. Probably learned to cook over a campfire like some kind of, well, like the vagrant you are." The words vagrant hung in the air like a curse. Rosa heard Giuseppe growl with anger behind her, heard Marie's sharp intake of breath. But she also heard something else. The murmurs of approval from some of the townspeople, people who were enjoying seeing someone they considered beneath them being put in their place. "Please," Professor Beaumont interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. "There's no call for such personal attacks. Rosa is a valued member of our company." "Valued?" Morrison snorted. "I'm sure she is. Probably the only person willing to work for whatever scraps you can afford to pay her." He turned back to Rosa, his eyes glittering with cruel amusement. "Tell me, cook, what's your specialty? Watery stew, burnt bread? Or do you just heat up whatever slop you can find in the garbage behind respectable restaurants?" The crowd roared with laughter now. Rosa felt as if she was shrinking under the weight of their mockery, becoming smaller and smaller until she might disappear entirely. These people didn't know her, didn't know about the praise she received from her circus family, didn't know about the techniques her grandmother had taught her, or the pride she took in her work. All they saw was what Morrison wanted them to see, a poor woman in dirty clothes who didn't belong in their world. Morrison stepped back, apparently satisfied with his performance. "Well, this has been enlightening. I trust you people will keep your noise down tonight. Some of us have real work to do in the morning." He remounted his horse and rode away, followed by his companions. The townspeople began to disperse, many of them still chuckling about Morrison's wit at the poor circus cook's expense. Rosa stood frozen in the dust, her cheeks burning with shame and humiliation. Around her, her circus family began to gather, offering words of comfort and support, but their kindness only made the sting worse. They shouldn't have to defend her from men like Morrison. She was supposed to be strong enough to handle such treatment. "Rosa," Marie said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder, "do not listen to that man. He knows nothing about who you are or what you do." But as Rosa nodded and tried to smile, she couldn't shake Morrison's words from her mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just a poor woman playing at being something more than she really was. Maybe all her pride in her cooking was just self-delusion. That night, as she prepared dinner for her circus family, Rosa's hands shook slightly as she seasoned the beans and turned the meat. Every stain on her apron felt like proof of Morrison's accusations, every callus on her hands like evidence of her unworthiness. She had faced poverty, loss, and uncertainty with courage. But somehow, Sam Morrison's casual cruelty had found its mark, planting seeds of doubt in soil that had been carefully tended with years of small victories and daily purpose. Outside her wagon, she could hear the sounds of the evening show beginning. The music, the applause, the joy that her circus family brought to the world. But for the first time in years, Rosa wondered if maybe she really was just fooling herself about her place in that world. The evening show had ended to thunderous applause, but Rosa barely heard it from inside her wagon, where she sat hunched over a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Morrison's words from that afternoon played in her mind like a broken record. Probably learned to cook over a campfire like some kind of vagrant. A gentle knock on her wagon door interrupted her brooding. "Rosa, it's Professor Beaumont. May I come in?" She quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Si, Professor. Come in." The elderly ringmaster had to duck to enter her cramped kitchen, his tall frame folding into the small space with practiced ease. His kind eyes took in her red-rimmed eyes and the barely touched dinner plate beside her. "Rosa, my dear, you mustn't let that man's ignorance poison your spirit." "But what if he is right, Professor?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "What if I am just fooling myself? Look at me, I am covered in stains. My hands are rough, I live in a wagon. Maybe I am just, what did he call me? A vagrant who heats up slop?" Professor Beaumont's expression grew stern, but his voice remained gentle. "Rosa Martinez, in my 63 years on this earth, I have eaten in fine restaurants from Boston to San Francisco. I have dined with senators and railroad barons, and I tell you this with absolute certainty, you are one of the finest cooks I have ever encountered." Rosa shook her head. "You are kind, Professor, but kindness has nothing to do with it," he interrupted. "Do you think I would risk the health and morale of this entire company if your cooking were merely adequate? Do you think Giuseppe would have the strength to lift those weights on watery stew? Do you think Marie could perform her aerial routines if she weren't properly nourished?" He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Rosa, you take whatever ingredients we can afford, sometimes just beans and a little salt pork, and you transform them into meals that taste like they came from the finest establishments. You make our meager budget stretch to feed 30 people nutritious, delicious food. That's not luck, my dear. That's skill, that's art." Despite herself, Rosa felt a small spark of her old pride returning. Professor Beaumont had never been one for empty flattery. But that man, he made everyone laugh. They all agreed with him. They laughed because he has money and power, and people are afraid to disagree with him, the professor said. "But I'll tell you something else, Rosa. Before you came outside today, I saw several of those same people at our afternoon show. They were smiling, they were enjoying themselves, they were forgetting their troubles for a few precious hours. That's what we do, all of us. We give people something beautiful in a world that can be very harsh." Rosa nodded slowly, but the hurt was still there, a dull ache in her chest. Professor Beaumont studied her face for a moment, then his eyes lit up with an idea that was both brilliant and dangerous. "Rosa, what would you say to showing Mr. Morrison exactly what kind of cook you really are?" "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, his voice taking on the theatrical quality he used when announcing acts, "what if you prepared something special? Something that would demonstrate your true abilities?" Rosa's eyes widened. "You want me to cook for him after what he said?" "I want you to cook for yourself, to prove to yourself that you are every bit as talented as I know you to be." He paused. "But if, in the process, Mr. Morrison happens to learn something about judging people by their circumstances rather than their character. Well, that would be an added benefit. Rosa sat in silence for several minutes, turning the idea over in her mind. It was risky. If she failed, if Morrison rejected whatever she made or mocked it, the humiliation would be even worse than what she'd endured that afternoon. But if she succeeded, what would I cook? She asked quietly. Professor Beaumont smiled. What would you cook for the most important meal of your life? What dish represents everything your grandmother taught you, everything you've learned on the road, everything you pour into feeding our family every day? The answer came to her immediately. Cochinita pibil. It was a dish her grandmother had taught her in the small village in Mexico where Rosa had been born. Pork marinated in achiote, bitter orange, and secret spices, wrapped in banana leaves and slow-cooked until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. It required time, patience, and skill to get right. The flavors were complex, earthy, tangy, with hints of smoke and spice that built on each other in layers. Then that's what you'll make, Professor Beaumont said. But Rosa, you must understand, this isn't about proving anything to Morrison. This is about proving something to yourself. The next morning, Rosa rose before dawn and rode into town on the professor's gentle mare. She had counted and recounted the money in her small leather pouch, barely enough for the ingredients she needed, but she would make it work. She always did. At McKinnon's general store, she carefully selected her supplies. A good piece of pork shoulder, dried chilies, achiote paste that had cost her nearly a week's wages, limes and garlic. The storekeeper, an elderly German named Klaus, watched her with curiosity. "Making something special, are you?" he asked in his thick accent. "Si, very special," Rosa replied, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. Back at camp, she began her preparation with the reverence of a religious ritual. She ground her spices by hand, the way her grandmother had taught her, releasing fragrances that transported her back to that small kitchen in Mexico where she had first learned that cooking was about more than just feeding people. It was about love, tradition, and the preservation of memory. She made her marinade with the precision of a chemist and the intuition of an artist. The bitter orange juice had to be balanced perfectly with the smokiness of the chiles and the earthiness of the achiote. Too much of any one element would throw off the entire dish. As she worked, other circus members stopped by to watch. They had never seen Rosa cook with such intensity, such focus. Hans, the animal trainer, inhaled deeply and closed his eyes. "Mein Gott, Rosa. What is that smell?" "Something my grandmother taught me," she replied, massaging the marinade into the pork with her hands. "She used to say that every dish tells a story. This one tells the story of who I really am." The meat would need to marinate for hours before she could begin the slow cooking process. As the morning wore on, Rosa found herself surrounded by the increasingly intoxicating aroma of her creation. The smell seemed to attract people like a magnet. First her circus family, then some of the local children who had come to watch the performers practice. "What are you making, lady?" asked a freckled boy of about 10, his nose pressed against the side of her wagon. "Something very special," Rosa replied. And for the first time since Morrison's attack, she smiled genuinely. By afternoon, the entire camp was filled with the rich, complex fragrance of cochinita pibil. Rosa had wrapped the marinated pork in banana leaves and buried it in a pit lined with coals, the way her grandmother had done in the old days. Now it was cooking slowly, the flavors melding and intensifying with each passing hour. Professor Beaumont appeared at her side, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Rosa, my dear, I believe Mr. Morrison and several of his associates will be joining us for dinner tonight." Rosa's stomach lurched. "You invited them without asking me? I merely mentioned to Mr. Hartwell at the bank that our cook was preparing a special meal tonight and that we would be honored to share it with some of the town's leading citizens. Word has a way of spreading in a small community." But what if he refuses to eat it? What if he mocks it without even tasting it? Professor Beaumont placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then he will reveal himself to be an even bigger fool than we already know him to be. But Rosa, I have absolute faith in your abilities. This dish will speak for itself. As the sun began to set, Rosa carefully unearthed her creation. The banana leaves had protected the meat while allowing it to steam in its own juices, and the aroma that escaped when she unwrapped it was nothing short of heavenly. The pork was so tender it fell apart at her touch, infused with the complex flavors of her marinade and enriched by hours of slow cooking. She prepared fresh tortillas on her small griddle, their corn fragrance adding another layer to the feast. She made a simple salsa with fresh tomatoes and chilies, and a small portion of perfectly seasoned rice. Each element was simple, but together they created something greater than the sum of their parts. Just as she was putting the finishing touches on her presentation, she heard the sound of horses approaching. Through her wagon window, she saw Morrison and 3 other well-dressed men dismounting near the main circus tent. Her hands began to shake. "Easy, mija," she whispered to herself, using her grandmother's pet name for her. "Remember who you are. Remember what you can do." Professor Beaumont appeared at her door. "Are you ready?" Rosa looked down at her creation. The tender, aromatic pork glistening in its own juices, the fresh tortillas still warm from the griddle, the vibrant colors of her salsa and rice. It was beautiful. More than that, it was a piece of her soul made manifest in food. "See," she said, her voice steady. "I am ready." She loaded everything onto a large wooden tray and walked out of her wagon with her head held high. The other circus members had gathered to watch, forming a loose circle around the main campfire, where Morrison and his companions sat stiffly on borrowed chairs. Morrison looked up as she approached, and she saw his expression shift from surprise to disdain. "Well, well," the cook returns. "Come to apologize for yesterday's outburst." Rosa set her tray down on a small table that Hans had quickly provided. The aroma immediately filled the air around the campfire, rich and complex and utterly delicious. She saw Morrison's companions exchange glances, their expressions showing interest despite themselves. "I have not come to apologize, Signor Morrison," Rosa said clearly. "I have come to share my food with you." Morrison laughed, but it sounded forced. "Your food? You mean you actually expect me to eat whatever this is?" "This is cochinita pibil," Rosa replied with dignity. "It is a dish from my grandmother's village in Mexico. The pork is marinated in achiote, bitter orange, and spices, then slow-cooked for hours until it becomes tender enough to fall apart. It is served with fresh tortillas, salsa, and rice." One of Morrison's companions, a man Rosa recognized as the town doctor, leaned forward slightly. "It certainly smells intriguing." Morrison shot him a sharp look. "Now see here, Williams. Just because something smells decent doesn't mean it's fit for civilized consumption. God knows what kinds of ingredients these people use." But Rosa could see that the aroma was working its magic even on Morrison. Despite his words, his nostrils flared slightly as he breathed in the fragrance. She had learned long ago that no one was immune to the power of truly exceptional cooking. "I understand your hesitation, Senor Morrison," she said calmly. "Perhaps you prefer simpler foods, beans and hardtack, like you mentioned yesterday?" It was a gentle challenge, delivered without malice, but with unmistakable intent. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he realized she was calling his bluff. "I'm not afraid of your exotic cooking," he said stiffly. "I've eaten in the finest establishments from here to Denver." "Then surely you would not be afraid to try one small bite?" Rosa asked, her voice honey-smooth. "Just to satisfy your curiosity?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Morrison's companions were watching him expectantly, and Rosa could see several townspeople gathering at the edges of the circle, drawn by the incredible aroma and the drama unfolding around the campfire. Morrison looked around at the faces watching him, then back at Rosa's calm, dignified expression. He was trapped by his own arrogance and the very public nature of their confrontation. "Fine," he said gruffly. "I'll try your whatever you call it, but don't expect me to pretend it's anything special." Rosa nodded graciously and began to prepare a plate. She selected the most perfectly cooked pieces of pork, arranged them artfully on a fresh tortilla, and added just the right amount of salsa and rice. Every movement was deliberate and practiced, the result of years of perfecting her craft. She handed the plate to Morrison with a slight bow of her head. "Buen provecho, Signor Morrison." Morrison took the plate with obvious reluctance, holding it as if it might bite him. The entire camp fell silent, everyone holding their breath as they watched this crucial moment unfold. Slowly, almost ceremonially, Morrison lifted the tortilla to his mouth and took a bite. Rosa watched his face intently, seeing the exact moment when the flavors hit his palate. His eyes widened slightly, then closed as the complex taste unfolded across his tongue. The tender pork, the smoky heat of the chilies, the bright acidity of the lime, the earthiness of the achiote, all combining in perfect harmony. For a moment, Morrison said nothing. He simply chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he took another bite, and another. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the distant sounds of the evening settling over the camp. Morrison continued eating, each bite more deliberate than the last, his face a mask of concentration. Finally, he set down the empty plate and looked up at Rosa. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What did you say this was called?" "De cochinita pibil," Rosa replied, her heart pounding. Morrison sat in silence for another long moment, staring at the empty plate as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Around him, his companions and the gathered crowd waited with bated breath for his verdict. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of its usual arrogance. I have never tasted anything like that in my life." The admission hung in the air like smoke, carrying with it the weight of recognition and the beginning of something that might eventually become humility. Sam Morrison sat in stunned silence, staring at the empty plate in his hands, as if it held answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. The flavors of Rosa's cochinita pibil still lingered on his tongue, complex, layered, absolutely unlike anything he had ever experienced. In his 42 years, including meals at the finest establishments from Denver to San Francisco, nothing had prepared him for the revelation that had just unfolded in his mouth. He began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. Around him, the entire circus camp watched in absolute silence. Even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, standing perfectly still in their picket lines. Dr. Williams, emboldened by Morrison's obvious reaction, leaned forward. "Sam, could I try a small portion?" Rosa, who had been watching Morrison with the intense focus of someone whose entire sense of self-worth hung in the balance, quickly prepared another plate. Williams took a bite, and his reaction was immediate and dramatic. His eyes closed, a soft moan of pleasure escaped his lips, and he nodded slowly as if confirming some fundamental truth about the universe. "Good Lord," he breathed. "Rosa, this is extraordinary." The banker, Pete Hartwell, and the third man, Judge Cromwell, followed suit. Each reaction was the same. Initial surprise, then wonderment, then something approaching reverence. Pete actually set down his plate after finishing and applauded. A slow clap that seemed to echo through the evening air. "Ma'am," Judge Cromwell said, removing his hat, "I have eaten in restaurants in Chicago and New York City, and I can honestly say that this rivals anything I've ever been served." Morrison looked up at Rosa, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Confusion, surprise, and the first crack in the armor of his certainty about the world and his place in it. For 20 years, he had built his identity on being the biggest, the richest, the most successful man in the valley. Part of that identity had required him to look down on people he deemed inferior, to maintain clear lines between the respectable and the unworthy. But the woman standing before him, this vagrant with flour in her hair and stains on her apron, had just created something that challenged every assumption he had made about worth, about talent, about the nature of superiority itself. "How long?" he asked quietly, his voice hoarse. "How long did it take you to learn to cook like this?" Rosa tilted her head, considering the question. "My grandmother began teaching me when I was 5 years old, Signor Morrison. But really, I am still learning every day. Each ingredient teaches you something new. Each person you cook for shows you something about what food can mean." "Your grandmother, was she a professional chef?" A small smile played at the corners of Rosa's mouth. "No, Signor. She was just a woman in a small village who believed that feeding people well was one of the ways you showed love. She used to say that anyone could fill a stomach, but it took skill and heart to nourish a soul." Morrison absorbed this, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the categories his mind had created for understanding the world. "But surely you must have trained in restaurants, learned from proper chefs." Professor Beaumont stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Morrison, Rosa learned her craft the same way most of the world's great cooks have learned, from family tradition, from necessity, from the desire to create something beautiful with whatever resources were available. Some of the finest cuisine in America comes not from fancy restaurants, but from home kitchens, where mothers and grandmothers have perfected their recipes over generations." Morrison looked around the circle of faces watching him. His companions, who had just experienced the same revelation he had, the circus performers who had known Rosa's talents all along, and the growing crowd of townspeople drawn by the extraordinary aroma and the unfolding drama. "I don't understand," he said, and for the first time in years, the admission of not understanding didn't feel like weakness. "How can someone who lives like this create something so what, Signor?" Rosa asked, her voice soft but carrying a note of challenge. Morrison struggled for words. "So perfect, so refined." Because," Rosa said, moving to sit across from him by the fire, "refinement is not about where you live or how much money you have. It is about caring enough to do something well. It is about understanding that even simple things, even feeding people, can be done with excellence if you bring your whole heart to the task." She gestured to her modest kitchen wagon. "I may not have a grand kitchen with modern conveniences, but I have good knives, fresh ingredients, and knowledge passed down through generations. Most importantly, I have people who depend on me to nourish them well. That is what makes the difference." Morrison set his plate down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. The certainty that had governed his life for so long was crumbling, replaced by a confusion that was both terrifying and somehow liberating. "Yesterday," he said slowly, "I called you a vagrant. I said you probably learned to cook over a campfire and didn't know how to prepare food fit for civilized people. See, you did. I was wrong." The words came out as barely a whisper, but in the stillness of the evening everyone heard them clearly. "I was completely wrong." Rosa nodded graciously. "We all make mistakes when we judge what we do not understand, Senor Morrison." But Morrison wasn't finished. The flood of realization was still washing over him, carrying away assumptions and prejudices he had held for decades. "It wasn't just about the cooking, was it? I looked at all of you, at your clothes, at your wagons, at your way of life, and I decided you were inferior. I decided you had nothing to offer people like me." Giuseppe, the strong man, had been watching from the edge of the circle. Now he stepped forward, his massive frame seeming less intimidating and more protective. "Signore Morrison, we are used to such judgments. In every town, there are people who see only what they expect to see. But that's just it," Morrison said, his voice growing stronger as the full weight of his error became clear to him. "I didn't just see what I expected to see. I chose to see only the worst. I chose to mock and belittle people who were doing nothing but trying to make an honest living and bring a little joy to the world. He stood up abruptly, his movement sending his chair scraping backward. Rosa, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt of gratitude. Senor, you could have responded to my cruelty with anger. You could have let my words poison your spirit and make you doubt your gifts. Instead, you responded with grace and with your art. You showed me something about myself that I needed to see, even if I didn't want to see it. Morrison looked around the circle, his gaze taking in each face. The circus performers he had dismissed as vagabonds, the townspeople who had been so quick to laugh at his cruel jokes, his own companions who were still processing their own assumptions and prejudices. I have spent my adult life building walls, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. Walls around my property, walls around my social position, walls around my heart. I told myself these walls were protection, that they kept out the unworthy and preserved what was good and right. But really they just kept me from seeing what was already good and right in the world around me. He turned to face Rosa directly, and she could see tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Rosa Martinez, would you do me the honor of accepting my sincere apology? And more than that, would you accept my gratitude for showing me that true refinement has nothing to do with wealth or social position, and everything to do with excellence and heart? Rosa stood as well, and for a moment the two faced each other across the fire. The wealthy rancher and the circus cook, separated by every social convention of their time and place, but connected now by something deeper than circumstance. See, Senor Morrison, I accept your apology, but more than that, I thank you for having the courage to change your mind when you discovered you were wrong. That takes a different kind of strength than building walls. Morrison nodded, then did something that shocked everyone present. He removed his hat and bowed deeply to Rosa, a gesture of respect usually reserved for ladies of the highest social standing. When he straightened, he looked around the circle again. I have something to say to all of you, and I want everyone in this camp to hear it clearly. I was wrong about Professor Beaumont's circus. I was wrong about the value of what you do and the kind of people you are. I let my prejudices blind me to talent, kindness, and dignity that were right in front of me. Professor Beaumont stepped forward, his lined face creased with emotion. Mr. Morrison, your recognition means more than you might realize. In most towns, we're tolerated at best. To have someone of your standing acknowledge our worth. My standing, Morrison interrupted, came from luck, inheritance, and business sense. Your worth comes from your talents, your dedication to your craft, and your commitment to bringing beauty into the world. I'd say your standing is considerably higher than mine. The transformation in Morrison was visible to everyone present. The rigid posture of superiority had given way to something more human, more open. The cruel edge that had characterized his voice was gone, replaced by genuine humility and wonder. Dr. Williams cleared his throat. Sam, I have to say, this has been educational for all of us. I think we all made some assumptions about our circus friends here. And that's exactly the problem, Morrison replied. We didn't bother to get to know them as individuals. We saw what we expected to see and stopped looking. He paused, then added, Rosa, would you be willing to teach me how to make this dish? I'd be honored to learn from someone with your skills. Rosa's eyes widened in surprise. You want to learn to cook, Senor Morrison? I want to understand what you do. I want to learn something about creating beauty instead of just acquiring it. He looked around his modest surroundings with new eyes, and maybe I want to understand what it means to put your heart into feeding people well. The request was so unexpected, so humble, that several of the circus performers exchanged glances of amazement. The man who had been their tormentor 24 hours earlier was asking to learn from the woman he had publicly humiliated. I would be honored to teach you, Rosa replied, but I must warn you, it is not easy. It requires patience, practice, and a willingness to fail many times before you succeed. Morrison smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Rosa, I spent 20 years learning how to run cattle and build a ranch. I think I can manage to learn how to cook from the best teacher I'm ever likely to find." As the evening progressed, something magical happened around that campfire. The walls that had separated the circus folk from the townspeople began to crumble, replaced by genuine curiosity and conversation. Marie demonstrated some simple acrobatic moves for the local children who had gathered to watch. Hans introduced Judge Cromwell to his trained horses, explaining the patience and trust required to work with the animals. Giuseppe arm-wrestled with some of the younger ranch hands, laughing and joking as if they were old friends. And at the center of it all, Rosa found herself surrounded by people eager to learn about her cooking, her background, her techniques. She shared stories of her grandmother, demonstrated how to properly balance the spices in her marinade, and patiently answered dozens of questions about ingredients and methods. Morrison stayed until late in the evening, participating in conversations, asking thoughtful questions, and visibly struggling to reconcile his new understanding with his old assumptions. As the fire began to die down and people started to drift away, he approached Rosa one final time. "Rosa, I want to make you an offer. If you ever decide to leave the circus, I would be honored to have you as the cook at my ranch. I'll pay you 3 times what anyone else in the valley would offer, and you'd have the finest kitchen and the best ingredients money can buy." Rosa studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his offer. "That is very generous, Signor Morrison, but this circus, these people, they are my family. I cannot abandon them, even for the finest kitchen in Colorado." Morrison nodded, a look of understanding crossing his features. "Of course, I should have known that someone with your loyalty wouldn't be tempted by money alone. Your circus family is very lucky to have you." He paused, then added, "But if you ever change your mind, the offer stands. And in the meantime, I hope you'll allow me to continue learning from you while you're here." "I would like that very much," Rosa replied. As Morrison prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. "Rosa, may I ask you something?" "Of course. When I was saying those terrible things yesterday, why didn't you defend yourself more strongly? You had every right to tell me exactly what you thought of my behavior." Rosa considered the question carefully before answering. "My grandmother used to say that when someone is determined to show you who they really are, it is better to let them finish speaking before you show them who you really are. Yesterday you showed me your anger and your prejudice. Tonight I showed you my cooking. Which do you think was more powerful?" Morrison stood in stunned silence for several moments, then shook his head in wonder. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman." "Sigh, she was, and she taught me that the best way to change someone's mind is not to argue with their words, but to offer them something so beautiful, so true, that their words become impossible to maintain." Morrison tipped his hat one final time. "Thank you, Rosa. For the meal, for the lesson, and for the reminder that true dignity comes from how we treat others, not from what others think of us." As he rode away into the night, Rosa remained by the dying fire, surrounded by her circus family. Professor Beaumont sat down beside her, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "Well, my dear, I think it's safe to say that you proved your point rather conclusively." Rosa shook her head. "I did not do this to prove a point, Professor. I did this to remember who I am. Senor Morrison's words yesterday made me forget for a little while that my worth does not depend on his opinion." "And now?" Rosa smiled, looking around at the faces of the people who had always believed in her worth. "Now I remember that the most important recognition comes not from those who judge us by our circumstances, but from those who judge us by our hearts, and from ourselves." Marie, who had been listening nearby, joined them by the fire. "Do you think he will really change? Men like that, with so much power and pride?" "I think," Rosa said thoughtfully, "that anyone who can admit they were wrong in front of all those people, anyone who can ask to learn from someone they once scorned, has already changed. The question now is whether he will have the courage to continue changing. Over the following days, as the circus prepared to move on to their next destination, Morrison kept his promise. He came to Rosa's wagon each morning, rolled up his sleeves, and learned to cook. He proved surprisingly teachable, approaching each lesson with the same intensity he had once brought to building his cattle empire. He learned to grind spices by hand, to judge the perfect doneness of meat by touch, to balance flavors with the precision of a chemist. More importantly, he learned to listen to Rosa's stories about her grandmother, to Giuseppe's tales of his village in Italy, to Marie's descriptions of learning to fly through the air. On the circus's final night in Cedar Valley, Morrison hosted a farewell dinner at his ranch, personally preparing cochinita pibil for 20 guests, with Rosa supervising every step. The meal was a triumph, and as the evening wound down, Morrison stood to address his guests. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion, "this week has taught me something I should have learned long ago. We are quick to judge what we don't understand, quick to dismiss what doesn't fit our expectations of how things should be. But if we closed our minds to everything that challenged our assumptions, we would miss out on most of life's greatest treasures." He raised his glass in a toast to Professor Beaumont's circus, who reminded us that beauty comes in many forms, to Rosa Martinez, who taught us that true refinement is about excellence and heart, not wealth and position, and to the lesson that the most important journey any of us can take is the one from judgment to understanding. The toast was echoed throughout the room, and Rosa felt tears of gratitude and joy streaming down her cheeks, not because she needed Morrison's approval, but because his transformation represented something beautiful about the human capacity for growth and redemption. The next morning, as the circus wagons rolled out of Cedar Valley, Rosa looked back to see Morrison standing on his porch, waving goodbye. In his other hand, he held a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the leftover cochinita pibil from the night before, which he had asked to keep as a reminder of the lesson he had learned. Professor Beaumont, riding beside her wagon, smiled with satisfaction. "Well, Rosa, I'd say we left Cedar Valley a little better than we found it." Rosa nodded, but her thoughts were already turning toward the road ahead, toward new towns and new opportunities to share her gifts. "Professor, do you think we changed Signor Morrison, or did he change himself?" The old ringmaster considered the question carefully. "I think, my dear, that you gave him the opportunity to see himself clearly for the first time in years. What he did with that opportunity, that was his choice, and he chose wisely." As the circus wagons rolled on toward their next destination, Rosa carried with her a renewed sense of her own worth and the power of responding to cruelty with grace, to judgment with excellence, and to hatred with the simple act of creating something beautiful enough to change minds and hearts. Behind them, Sam Morrison began his day in his ranch kitchen, grinding spices for a simple breakfast and thinking about a small woman in a stained apron who had taught him that true nobility had nothing to do with titles or wealth, and everything to do with bringing your whole heart to whatever task lay before you. The transformation was complete, but the story would continue in the choices each of them made every day thereafter. Rosa in her commitment to nurturing her circus family, Morrison in his new understanding of what it meant to judge character over circumstances, and both of them in the knowledge that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the simple act of sharing a perfectly prepared meal with someone who needs to remember what excellence really looks like.